Welcome back to wagertalk.com. We're going to take a look at some handicapping tips for March Madness. This is part 2. You've got mine and Ralph Michaels in a different video. Now we're going to hear from Tony, Finn, and Preston, the Sports Cheetah. I'm going to start with you, Preston. March Madness, it's different than the conference tournaments, the handicap. Is there anything you look at, you like to do that's different for just this tournament?
Sure. There's 3 things that I'm going to try to go through very quickly. And one is something new that a buddy of mine that was on the Last Word Cheetah podcast that we recorded last week brought up. And I thought it was worth considering. And so I'm going to be kind of tracking it as we go. First 2, I should say, are things that I've always done. One, particularly, is looking at the coaching and weighing it more heavily into my actual handicapping and modeling, too. You have these games that are Thursday, Saturday, Friday, Sunday, short turnarounds. You have one day to prep for, and I guess even when you win, sometimes you're looking at 2 teams that you could potentially play, and then you basically have 24 hours to prep for the team that ultimately you're facing. A coach that can effectively game plan both offensively and defensively versus a coach that just isn't as good at that. I mean, I'm going to be siding with the coach that can, and there's obvious track records for certain coaches. People can look into that stuff, and I think it is viable in a tournament like this where you don't have all that time to prepare. And it's more of a pressure moment for the coaching staff. Second thing is three-point shooting. Teams that rely heavily on shooting the 3, they're shooting in arenas they haven't shot in yet. With weird backdrops and depth perception, it's really tough to shoot. I've shot in college arenas before versus like the local gym, and that's hard enough for me, let alone some of these big stadium-type settings. It's really tough for three-point shooting teams, I think, that are already kind of high variance anyway to bet on because three-point shooting's so random. And now it could be even worse when you have a team like, say, Marquette, who shoots 43% from 3 this year, leads the nation, playing South Carolina, who's 5th in the country against the 3. They only give up 29% three-point shooting. It's a tough game to bet. It's like what's going to really, be the straw that falls or makes everything crash down. The three-point shooting is just tough to bet on. So I follow that, like teams that can obviously score in other ways if I'm going to back them. Third thing that Zona Cats brought up, excuse me, was teams that score in transition a lot. It's harder, and especially later in the tournament when games really slow down. If you can't dictate that pace, like say UCLA likes to get up and run, even UNC sometimes, although they can score in the half court, but if you rely heavily on transition baskets and points and getting to the free throw line that way, it's much tougher to get those opportunities in the tournament when the game's slowing down and against better competition. So I wouldn't bet on those teams that rely heavily on transition, not on teams that rely heavily on 3 or on ones that aren't coached well, especially in that second game on a weekend.
All right, good stuff. Tony?
Well, that's good. Very good analysis. I would agree with almost all of that. And just to add a couple points, and that is, as important as ATS or against the spread is, and people, even weekend warriors, even the public focuses on that, the tournament's different. It's different because for the most part you have 67 total games, but the teams that are in here are winning teams, and for the most part, many of them public teams where the line is shaded to a degree. And the only extra point that I would throw in on Preston's is, while ATS is important, it's not near as important as how the teams that are facing now that have been favorites in some of the non-Power 6 conferences I would refer to, that are favorites that are now dogs. How did they do as dogs? How were they on the road? How were they in neutral courts? And all those things, there's a lot of different variables. Coaching, I think, is critical in this situation. And first round games, if you're a Thursday game, do you have the depth to, while the tournament has longer timeouts and longer resting periods than regular season games, there's still a transition from, do you have the depth to go from a hard-fought Thursday game and have your guys fresh for a Saturday? And much of that is, as Preston referred to, there's great coaches, but how good of a coach are you in game? What kind of adjustments can you make? So the variables are expansive on what you would take into consideration, but I think he did a good job, and my only addition to that would be, how did you play? How did some of the third world country teams, as I put them, play as a dog, even though they're in the tournament, and most of the time they were favorites?
2 things that I'm going to throw in real quick that I didn't mention in my video on March Madness. When you do go back to the beginning of the season and look, because that's where people are going to look at some of these teams. How did they do, out of conference at the beginning of the year? Remember, look at the starters. How many people were returning? Because if you had a team that only had 1 or 2 starters returning, they're not going to be the same team that they were in November and December now that they've had a full season.
One example of that, Princeton, their best player wasn't even playing in some of their non-conference games, and people are like, oh, they lost by 9 and 3. Don't worry. And it's also 3 months later. I mean, teams are just so much different anyways, even with the same
They have the experience now.
Sure.
And the other thing is, and this is something where you talked about three-point shooting, look at teams that are more balanced with their scoring, because if you have a team that relies on one player for most of their offense, if he has an off shooting night or gets into foul trouble, that team then is in trouble. Where if you have a team that's more balanced, you can have that one player have the off night and still be able to advance. Those are a couple other things to look at with your stuff. And it all goes to put your homework in. That's
I think you're leading into another video we're going to have here soon.
So there you go. All right, guys. Hey, don't forget, each and every Friday, it's Flashback Friday. You can get any play on Friday for $7 at wagertalk.com. We do it each and every Friday, and boy, this week, what a Friday to do it. It's March Madness. There's games all day long. Check it out this week at wagertalk.com. We'll be back with more at Wager Talk.